there was a concerted effort to smear me as a pro-genocide Zionist, and we had supporters canceling by the dozens. And when that starts happening, it took us 10 years to build up 11,000 supporters. You don't know where that ends.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ralph Benmergui. Welcome to Not That Kind of Rabbi. A lot going on. And one of the things that caught my eye was some of the social media posts by one of Canada's prominent podcasters and producers and journalists. And I wanted to talk to him about it. So, hey, I'm going to do that right now. His name is Jesse Brown. You may know him from Canadaland. You also may know him if you were in the animation business from Bit Strips, which when I worked at Sheridan College, it was one of the things we talked to students about. You know, you can do this kind of thing, and it's entrepreneurial and interesting and fun. And one of the things I've always been fascinated about with Jesse was, yes, he's a journalist, but he's also an entrepreneur. And those two things don't necessarily go together. You can be one or the other often. But in his case, it seems to have been a nice marriage of talents. So, without further ado, please welcome to Not That Kind of Rabbi, Jesse Brown. How are you, sir?
I'm doing all right. How are you, Ralph?
I'm all right. We've never actually spoken before in all these years, so it's nice to finally meet you.
Likewise.
Thank you. One of the things that caught my eye was during this really hard time since October 7th, you know, as journalists, we tend to look at things as gray, not as black and white. And I felt like you were more willing to go towards one side of this than the other in terms of how you saw a rise in anti-Semitism, how you saw a perception in this country. And I just was curious as to what, I know it must have been a moment where you thought, nah, I'm going there. What made you go there?
Honestly, there was no conscious decision to do anything differently than I've always done. Canadaland, some people may not be familiar, but you know, our prime focus and kind of reason why I started the thing 11 years ago was to do media criticism, was to keep a watchful, critical eye on the Canadian media. And social media, the podcast is the main thing, but I've always used Twitter and social media as a soapbox or a place to just comment and really do. It's perfectly made for taking an article or something that happened and a little bit of commentary. One of the main things that Canadaland has always done what are we critiquing the Canadian media about? We're not partisan. I've never come at this for the political agenda, but racism and discrimination has always been a focus, and it seems like an important thing to document, and it's a possible thing to document because you can look at coverage of Muslims and say, hey, why do they point out when the criminal was a Muslim, but they didn't point out when the criminal was a white guy or, you know, a Christian? You can find those patterns. Or National Post articles against immigration that were making all kinds of claims. Post Media had this notorious column about refugees killing goats in their hotel room. It turned out to be a complete fabrication. We've always done this. We've always pointed these things out. And it just so happened that most of the coverage of discrimination and racism was coverage of Islamophobic or anti-Indigenous or anti-Black racism. After October 7th, I saw coverage that was different when it came to how Jewish community was being targeted. I saw, I think, a discrimination via ignorance where the journalists didn't seem to understand the nuances of if a protest against Israel turns and directs its anger towards the Jewish Community Center. To me, I understand the line that was just crossed there. And it didn't seem to me that the media always did. And so I was pointing these things out, and I tried to do so in as reporterly a way as I could and simply say things like, this is a Jewish-owned bookstore on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, which has had red blood sprayed on its windows. Really try to, I sometimes do opinion work, but I knew how sensitive this stuff was, so I really tried to keep it on the level of fact. This is what happened. So that's how it began. The response took me by surprise.
Well, we'll get into that in a second, but you just said something that I was thinking I was going to ask you as you were speaking, which is, we seem to have crossed a line, but a while ago, years ago, really, where fact became opinion. What do you do with that when people say, 98% of scientists say climate change is real? Well, that's your opinion.
Well, I mean, this is the great crisis of the moment, is like, do we have a shared set of objective facts? As our capacity as this kind of beleaguered sector, the journalists who are dedicated to a practice that holds at its center the notion that you can, through this process of interrogation, of getting multiple sources, of asking both sides for you can provide people a factual basis from which to make their decisions and to form their opinions. And what started as, I think, an interesting and overdue interrogation of that. Is that even possible? Is there one true set of facts? I think those are interesting questions. Is it possible to be objective? I was really engaged in those sorts of challenges to traditional journalism. I think they're valid questions to ask. But what they've led to is an erosion of the quality of that process to begin with. Whatever we might say about what comes out the other end, it produced, it's one way of arriving at some sort of a record. And, as we've challenged whether, is it true? Is it good? Is it worthwhile? We've also simultaneously, maybe related, maybe unrelated, seen a cratering, we're down, 20, 30,000 journalists in Canada. So the actual capacity to gather this information is, at an absolute low point. So, I'm not exactly sure, how do we look at it? Do we look at it as we've lost our faith in objective reality, or simply that a bunch of technological changes have come that have given everybody the ability to broadcast their opinion as loud as the biggest television broadcaster of 20, 30 years ago, and simultaneously destroyed the business model for the fact-gathering process known as journalism?
What role do you think podcasting has played in that? Because just like the internet itself, there was this whole desire for democratization. I don't have to wait for permission to have a show. I don't have to wait for permission to be widely available. Where does podcasting fit into what sometimes feels to me like a circus of opinion?
I mean, there's all kinds of stuff you'll find. There's a bunch of crap and there's a bunch of great stuff, but I'm a pretty passionate advocate. I think that as people's attention spans have been getting smaller and smaller, as the average size of a piece of media has been getting truncated until, the most popular media right now are these TikTok videos or Instagram Reels, these threads, these bite-sized videos, which are very much about, some of them are brilliant, but they really are about vibe and comedy and visuals and emotion. People are doing good things with that medium as well, but by and large, this is these are mediums that I think illustrate just how frenetic and how distracted people have become. It's very hard to get a substantive conversation into a TikTok video. Then you've got suddenly podcasts, where, you can't blame it all on TikTok. The size of a newspaper article had been getting smaller and smaller over the course of decades. People thought that, sound bites, news clips, breaking news, next story. And here we have this medium in podcasting that's all about the intimacy of the human voice, in which listeners will dedicate 8, 9, 10 episodes to one story, and where rigorous investigative journalism is one of the most popular formats around. It's breathed new life into news. There's a lot of people listening to Canadaland who do not listen to, or they don't read the news. this is how they get their information. They might not be getting informed, if not. And there's a much larger audience for the Daily, who are not necessarily newspaper readers who also listen to the Daily. They would not have a relationship with the New York Times or with any newspaper if it was not for the Daily. So I see it as like a really promising and special outlier that's to be protected. It's completely bucking the trends. It's in opposition to where everything else is going. It's a sign of hope.
Yeah, I also think though that there was a meeting, a weaving of shock radio in the United States and podcasts too, because you need to gather ears. You need people to pay attention, and in shock radio, you always had that, that ability to just say enough to provoke someone to respond. So I guess it's sort of an arena where we get into that whole muddled piece about free speech. But let's think first. I want to talk about campus anti-Semitism and your view of how the right and the left, do they meet when they come full circle around to each other, and what that says to the Jewish communities of North America?
I mean, I don't even know at this point what those concepts right or left mean, but I know that there certainly are people who seem to belong to both camps who do not like Jews and who are making life miserable for Jews. It's one of the many really horrifying realities to face, is that for many years there were, people who I think identified as on the progressive left, and there's people who have been colleagues of mine who were very dedicated to rooting out Jew hatred, anti-Jew hatred, when it was perpetrated by the alt-right. And there are people who would spend hours combing through archived social media posts and podcasts from the Rebel Media crew or Associated people, or all those people who showed up in Charlottesville, or people who were trying to clean up their image and present themselves as mainstream. But if you really dedicated yourself, you could find in their archives evidence that they were that they didn't like Jews. That was, and I published work like that. I thought that was important work to find out what those people really think. But the same people who were so interested in whether or not these right-wing figures were anti-Semites turn a blind eye when bricks are breaking the windows of synagogues and schools, when you don't have to go through hours of archives, when there are Molotov cocktails and bullets being fired. It's a similar situation where there is reason to interrogate the connections between what some people want to present as a legitimate political movement. And when I think there is a legitimate side to it, and I think it's legitimate to criticize Israel. There's nothing inherently wrong with that or anti-Semitic about that. But at first the possibility, and later the probability, and then finally the obvious conclusion that there are links between the pro-Palestine movement and these acts of anti-Semitic violence is something that people who used to be very interested in anti-Jewish racism and hatred not only ignore, but I find are very angrily opposed to. They will shout you down and oppose any discussion that these things might bear some relationship to each other.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.
So there's this idea of a privileged minority, that people see North American Jews as, they're they got money, they're smart, they do what they want, and they don't need. I don't give them sympathy. They're privileged people, as opposed to if it's an issue of Latino or Black issues in the United States, indigenous issues here, and racialized communities here. What do you make of that idea that there's no sympathy because, hey, they're fine. I don't feel for them.
I mean, I think that exists, and I think that it does speak to a hierarchy that has grown around, I guess, what you call identity politics, as to who is, different people can be seen as oppressed or as minorities, but to different degrees. I don't mind engaging with these ideas. I am privileged. I don't really feel like I experienced racism in any significant way in my life till about a year ago. I think that's worth looking at, but I fall off. We're struggling to communicate complicated ideas about this tiny community, this tiny minority that we belong to, where it's not a new idea that Jews reached a level of inclusion in larger society to a point where our otherness almost disappears, only for it to be radically reasserted. And I had a conversation with one of our journalists, Emily Nicolas, some time ago about how, there's no question that I'm a white man, and enjoy all of the privileges that come with that. But when I think of my paternal grandparents, they had thick Yiddish accents. They were very garlicky, as my wife puts it. They read ethnic. They were not part of their society in Winnipeg the way that a white. They were not quite white, and over the course of 2 generations, we became white. But the whiteness is conditional. The whiteness can be revoked at any time. This is not a new phenomenon. The Jews, the Haskalah Jews in Austria and throughout Europe, some of them were more European than Europeans. I think they considered themselves, some of them considered themselves no longer Jewish anymore, but their Jewishness was asserted back upon them. So I don't think that legacy and that history of hatred, that cycle the Jews experience, is relatable to other people. It's unique. It's strange. And so I try to be generous in my thinking that if you only see the world through a lens of, the wretched of the earth and the colonizers and the oppressor and oppressed, and that is a useful lens for understanding a lot of why the world is organized the way that it is. And if you go through that sort of education and you ask yourself questions about why certain countries are impoverished and other ones aren't, and that will help you understand things. But it doesn't help you understand Jews. And
why not?
Why not? Because we don't fit. We're whatever you want us to be. If you want to cast us as oppressors and overlords, people are rooting through history to find, all the oldest, ugliest things reemerging. All these, I'm seeing people dabbling dangerously in half truths and broken histories of, the Jewish participation in the slave trade. If those who I think have malintent and want to boot Jews out of the, ranks of those deserving of protection from discrimination, deserving to not be, menaced. You could find your nuggets. You could find those things. And then there's some voices within Jewish communities that want to kind of assert the opposite. And we're a messy and complicated people. And we're different all over. So it's I'm trying to I'm trying to find a generosity, not to just be angry, because I think there's just a lot of ignorance and confusion.
And
It's
how's
really
that going for you so far?
not well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, you've done similar work to me throughout your career, and as a broadcaster, as whatever, I've been at CBC, a podcast. It doesn't matter to me if I've got 100,000 people, 1 million people watching on TV, or 50,000 on a podcast, or 100 at a speaking event, or 10. The emotional presence of somebody like us has to be one not of anger, but of gratitude. The fact that people want to hear what we have to say. It's all I know how to do is talk, is try to think and write and talk. And the fact that anybody cares, I have to be grateful, and I have to show up to work, not angry, but grateful that people care what I have to say, and the people who are still listening, which is the vast majority of my listenership, are the people who I feel grateful towards. And many of them even pay for the work that we do, and to hear my voice and others. And yet, I'm waking up every morning, and more so trying to go to bed every night. I don't want to say surprised, because this is what I was trained for my whole life. I think a lot of Jewish people grow up, being told, you go ahead, love your neighbor, but there may come a time when they'll either turn against you or they'll turn their back on you. They'll be okay with what's happening.
Yeah, it was a difficult thing for me throughout my life to just go, I can't keep looking over my shoulder. I can't keep thinking there's an anti-Semite under every rock. I have to free myself of that to have a generosity of my own spirit towards other people. And when I see what's going on now, I've always said to people, diasporic Judaism always has to be aware that this is a rental. It may be a good rental at this moment in time, but at a certain point, like we came from Morocco, 500 years in Morocco, and then rentals up, and off we came to Canada, and who knows how long we'll stay here. And to your earlier point about, I guess, about assimilation and driving ourselves towards power centers so that we are not as vulnerable and we are part of the power. Now we find ourselves in a situation where I wonder what you're thinking. Let's talk media literacy for a moment. When you hear reports from Gaza and Israel at this point in time, where are we at? Has Hamas won the PR war? Is it really a lack of sympathy, and or is there something to the idea that we have turned into people that we don't recognize right now? Where are we at?
Well, I'll offer, I'm sorry not to be more direct. I try to be very careful and thoughtful about what I say about these topics. And I am a journalist who covers the Canadian media. I'm a Jewish person. I have opinions about what's happening in Israel. I'm a news reader, so I have opinions about what's happening in Israel. But I'm not an expert on that topic. And I question, we're in this moment where it seems like everybody feels like what they have to say about this is really valuable and important. Like that's what the conflict, that's what everybody needs, is what I think about and I diligently avoid these conversations because I've never had one that I think is, I care about the point of conversations, You're asking good questions. I don't mean to disparage them. One of the things that I've been struggling with over this past year is, I think you said something at the beginning about whether seeing things in black and white or the gray or choosing a side. I feel like what I've been fighting for this past year is the fight to remain independent. There's been this incredible pressure where this is what war does. You've got to choose a side. And as soon as you say something that doesn't feel consistent or compatible with one side, people want to force you on the other. And I've been accused of being a paid Hasbarist, an agent of Israel, like ridiculous conspiracy theories. I have no, role in defending the actions of Israel. I don't know how any human being can see the images that we're seeing out of Gaza and feel like this is great. This is fantastic what's happening. This is, I don't think this is like a political comment. War is hell. It's the worst thing that human beings do to each other. And industrialized death and killing is the worst of us. Whoever's doing it, it's terrible to see. But I'll venture into the territory that you're inviting me into. As a person who observes the media. Has Israel lost the PR war? Yeah, it's a devastating failure. Just a complete. From a point of highest sympathy after October 7th that I can remember, to I'm not going to say universal disdain. But it's as bad as it's ever been, and it's even to the extent that Israel is still allied with the biggest powers in the world. You get the sense every day that it's a fraught, that what they really think is not allyship. Now, that being said, were those feelings always there? And was that, that sympathy lasted for, 24 hours? I don't necessarily agree with a certain cynical Jewish take that everyone's a closet anti-Semite. Everybody. I see a lot more harm done, and I think that I'm not even trying to be Pollyanna-ish about it, but trying to understand the world I live in. There's a lot more to fear through people who do not have predisposed negative anti-Jewish feelings showing up because they legitimately are horrified by what they're seeing. And they want to take part in a peace movement and not knowing very much about the people who are organizing this or what the ultimate goals are, what the underlying philosophy is. And within 2 or 3 chants, you go from ceasefire now to globalize the Intifada to from water to water, Palestine is Arab. Suddenly, you're actually calling for an Arab ethno-state. I think that moral confusion and the co-opting of good-natured people who are really operating out of what I always thought was a Jewish humanitarian. You don't turn a blind eye to massacres of people, of dispossessed, oppressed people. You should take to the streets to stand up for them. I don't consider those people anti-Semites for doing that, but it's really, really hard to watch them get Nazified, I'm sorry, I don't know how else to put it. It's really hard to watch people become, through moral righteousness and passion, find themselves lending their voices to what is explicitly an exterminationist, eliminationist philosophy that has no place for the 7 million Jews who live there. I mean, I don't know what to say about that. So it puts me at all.
So a friend of mine, broadcaster, Howard Glassman, Humble and Fred, calls me up about a month after this all starts to go south, as it were. And he just simply said, "Ralph, why do they hate us so much? Why over millennia have we been hated?" And there didn't seem to be an answer to that, but it did feel that way for him, a kind of confusion as to, have I done something to you? Am I doing something to you? There's so many complex feelings going on right now in the Jewish community itself. But one of the things I found interesting, the Hartman Institute in Israel does a podcast. Yossi Klein Halevi and Daniel Hartman. It's a good podcast. And about a month after I'd spoken to Howard, I heard them talking, and Halevi said, on October 6th, Israel was on the verge of civil war over the taking over of the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
On October 8th, we were all united in a war against an enemy. And I find this sort of, within the Jewish community, a tension about Israel right or wrong, or legitimate criticism, even within our own communities, of what goes on there. Because for the first time ever, since 2,000 years minimum, we have a so-called homeland, and we're not just diasporic. So is the idea of holding on to this piece of land of Gwynne Dyer said it once years ago in a documentary series he did on war, which was brilliant at the time. If you have a country, you have to be willing to kill to keep it. And so I wonder if there's a kind of a message in here that we're not getting about all these ideas. It's like the astronaut who goes to space and sees a big blue ball with no lines on it for, I'm from Canada, I'm from Poland, I'm from this. Is there a lesson we can take from all this about this idea of ownership and worshiping land?
A lot of interesting ideas in that question, and I'll respond to it, I guess, in the spirit that it's asked, which is like, it's kind of like a philosophical, or like, I consider myself, when I was 18, like a lot of Jewish people, like went to Israel on one of those trips. And a lot of people had a spiritual connection to the land. They fell to their knees. They said they would make aliyah. I didn't feel any of that. I was brought up to feel some kind of connection to the land, but that's not my Judaism. And my Judaism doesn't have to be anybody else's. But my understanding of myself as a Jew is one that is proud of the disconnection from dirt, from the nation state. That we are a people defined by something that exists between us mentally. Some people would say spiritually, but not physically necessarily. That we're a people who survived for thousands of years through a system of thought, a way of seeing the world, a way of thinking about morality, a sense of humor, a sense of a financial system that was created, ideas and numbers and text and words. I'm a diaspora Jew, and that's my point of personal identification with this thing that we both belong to. It's not something that easily. I did not feel when I was in Israel, oh, finally I'm surrounded by other Jews. I've never felt at home around other Jews. I think you and I both grew up in Forest Hill around other Jews, feeling other among other Jews. It's the most Jewish thing in the world for me to not feel included anywhere. And I've made my peace with that. And I feel like that there's a way to be that's okay. So, I could go on about these concepts, but it's really personal, and other people are entitled to feel differently. When we're actually talking about this country called Israel, I reject any of these ideas or lenses that we put on it, or philosophies that single it out in a way that ends up being discriminatory. The world is organized by nation states. Very few of those nation states have bloodless histories. People conquer people. People take land through war, through treaties. There is nothing
like we do here in Canada.
Yes, that is not an excuse for not contending with history, for not trying to make history right, for not having truth and reconciliation, maybe for giving land back. That's the process that we're engaged in here in Canada. No one outside of the very radical fringe of the discourse is discussing the ethnic cleansing of settlers from Canada. We're trying to find a way to live together. So why would I apply a different lens to Israel?
Yeah. So where do we go from here in terms of the media lens? What do you think would contribute to a better outcome in terms of storytelling?
a better outcome. I have I have a privileged point of view on this because I've been so lucky. I by accident have found myself, I got into podcasting early enough, and I don't know, I was doing something right and was able to get an audience and was able to turn enough of that audience into a paid audience. So the macro trends that are influencing everything else, Google and Facebook destroy the ad market and newspapers fall apart, or the platforms control and algorithms control what information gets rewarded. So the information skews towards the shorter, the more angry making. I've sat all that out. I have this little shop where listener by listener, I'm building an audience, and most of the money comes directly from them. And even when I found myself really beset and targeted and boycotted by people from pro-Palestine activism circles who rejected my efforts to, when I first started putting these things out, I legitimately thought, okay, there are people in this movement who are not anti-Semitic and who don't support anti-Semitism. They should know that this one person had a Hamas flag. They should know that this one group of protesters turned on the community center. They will want to excise that from their movement. This is good information for the people who want to protest and have a legitimate movement that is a peace protest. And I was wrong about that. Or if they exist, their voices are not loud. What happened instead is that there was a concerted effort to smear me as a pro-genocide Zionist, and it veered into outright anti-Semitic hatred and death threats and phone calls to my home, and an effort to get my advertisers to cut off their funds to Canadaland, get my employees to leave the company. It became an all-out boycott attempt, and it started to work. And we had supporters canceling by the dozens. And when that starts happening, it took us 10 years to build up 11,000 supporters, and you start to see dozens of them leaving every day. You don't know where that ends. It ended at about 9%, right? About 9% of people left saying, I don't want to support this I don't know how to respond to these people. Like yesterday, they were paying me to do journalism for them, and today they're accusing me of supporting a genocide. I don't have any position on... the only position I ever took was I think ultimately Israel needs to be safe and Palestine needs to be free. And what's happening in Gaza is not okay. So I don't know how you take from that I'm a pro-genocide person unless you've been swayed by people who are just concertedly asserting that I am on this side. I am on this pro-genocide side. And it was incredibly hard for me to see my own supporters and my own subscribers believing that and canceling and resisting the urge to argue with them or plead with them. But, I didn't. But it stopped. And I think that there's something in there that is useful to a lot of institutions that find themselves facing a lot of pressure. Because when you wake up in the morning and there's people picketing, or there's 100 phone calls, or there's 100 emails, or there's people cutting their support, you feel like the whole thing might be collapsing. The vast majority of people out there do not want anger and rage and the destruction of institutions. The vast majority of the people out there can tell the difference between a peace movement and I think what is increasingly becoming a hate movement. I think that people want there to be civil discourse. They're not trying to stamp out all criticism of Israel. But I think that when we see people expressing themselves by tearing up the lawn, at McGill, that some landscaper is going to have to go resaw, this is an ugliness that I think that the overwhelming majority of people are reaching their fill of it, and have sort of allowed these things, have kept quiet, but I feel like that's changing.
Yeah, you have to be careful, though, that it's not about What's the entertainment value of the situation? How much can I stay engaged in it? What's next? What's Trump saying? What do I do about this? And, a year from now, will this be an issue? What happens to this feeling that, anti-Semitism was there? I've lived my whole life hoping it wasn't. A year from now, where are we going to be?
I have no idea. I try to find a way out of my very angry feelings, which I know are that's just a surface layer on sadness. This has made me so sad this past year, but I can't say that I'm surprised. Like it is the world as it was described to me, and it is a part. What we're experiencing now is a large part of what it is to be a Jew, and has always been a part of what it is to be a Jew. And the period of peace and inclusion was the aberration. And I feel like I feel grateful to know that. I feel grateful to have the opportunity to do something about it. I know the polarities that Jewish existence can kind of oscillate between. I know that it's worth pushing back against the way things are heading right now. So I try to be equal to the task. I don't know what's coming next. It could get very, very bad.
Thank you for taking this time to be with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ralph. I did want to ask you one question.
Yeah.
What kind of rabbi are you?
I'm a mashpiach. I'm a spiritual counselor, but I'm not a rabbi. But if I was a rabbi, I wouldn't be that kind of rabbi.
All right.
All right, my friend. You take care of yourself. Jesse Brown, Canadaland. How do people get in touch with you, and how do they listen to your podcasts?
Canadaland.com, Canadaland, wherever you listen to your podcast. Come support Canadaland. We're like the last place left. You're going to hear opinions you don't like on Canadaland. You might hear some that you do, and we publish both. And that's something that's pretty unique right now. Like it's all partisan now, but we still think it's important to hear things you don't agree with. So come check out Canadaland.
You take care of yourself, all right?
You too.